functionality that we're seeing. Does this indicate that maybe Farber was right? I don't know. It could be. So anyway, I think this book by using these vignettes of these individuals, it really gives us a picture of what the conservative movement has been doing, at least since the 1930s. And it's very enlightening, I think. The one thing I'd add about the bibliography that I gave you is books that I added. Just let me say a word about those, and I'll move on and talk more about this with you if you'd like. Dan Carter's The Politics of Rage. This is a book that really traces that transformation of the South from solidly Democratic to solidly Republican. It's very good the way it demonstrates that it's all kind of tied up in these racial politics. Okay. Both Kevin Phillips' books, his Politics of Rich and Poor, this is the book that first opened my eyes to what was happening to our tax system under Reagan. Kevin Phillips, as you may know, had actually been a leading light in the first Reagan administration. And he had advocated for Reaganomics, basically. But during the administration, the first 4 years, he sees what the impact of what they're doing is on American society. And he sees how it's completely shifting the burden of taxation onto the middle class and allowing the wealthy to get essentially a free ride. He understands this is not a good thing. And so he leaves the Reagan administration and works on this book, which comes out shortly after Reagan is out of office. But it's full of nuts and bolts, graphs, all kinds of data that shows the actual impact of what Reagan did. And of course, things have only gotten worse since then. So I think to look at his book and his analysis, coming from a guy who'd originally supported these ideas, I think is a good thing. His other book, American Theocracy, as you can see, it really focuses on the role of religion on the radical right. And I think that's also very, very useful. The next two books, I'm a historian of foreign policy, so I'm a diplomatic historian. So these next two books deal with this: The Rise of the Balkans, The History of Bush's War Cabinet. This is kind of a history of the neocons, and it takes each of the individuals in Bush's cabinet, Rumsfeld, Condoleezza Rice, all these folks, and biographically it traces their history, the influences on them, the decisions they were making, the things that drove them. It's a very good book. Jim Mann is a journalist. Andrew Bacevich is a political scientist, and he's done a couple of really valuable books now. This is the first one that I noticed has come out with another one. The New American Militarism, How Americans Are Seduced by War. And his argument in this is just, it's very convincing about the simplicity that war has become, almost like a video game, and how it's easy for Americans to do this. And it's just a great book, and it's written by a guy who is also a conservative, but he had a son killed in the Gulf War, and I think this caused him to have this revelation about why were we invading people for pointless reasons. So that's all I've got to say. Any questions, comments?
I would propose that, given the time constraints that we have, that we stay on course and then have the Q&A in the final session.
Sure.
So we'll go ahead and move to Stan Corcoran and talk about charter schools. Thank you, John.
Yep.
So the reason I'm talking about charter schools, as best I can tell, is that I wanted to set up a context for talking about charter universities, which are kind of the next phase of this conservative education movement. And I think that talking about, thinking about charter schools within the context of the defunding of the public sector gives us an opportunity to enlarge the idea, so it's not simply a mode of schooling, but rather it's a means of eliminating what we think of as the public. So charter schools really began as a glimmer in Albert Shanker's eye around 1970, and they were in response. I think that it's important to think of charters, to think of the the conception of charter schools as a response to the decline of American cities. So, Albert Shanker was the head of the New York Federation of Teachers, which became the American Federation of Teachers, and was I would say, a right-of-center socialist. So a guy who believed in public education, but believed in the exacting qualitative standards from all students. And this led him into all sorts of issues of local disputes over local control in the New York City schools as they were becoming poorer, browner, and blacker in the late 1960s, and it kind of culminated in an incident in Brownsville, Brooklyn, where parents and people involved, community activists, attempt to dislodge the teaching staff at certain secondary and high schools in order to bring in a more relevant curriculum, which is, of course, a very 60s word. Subsequently, the New York City schools, and really all urban schools, as a matter of middle-class flight, the defunding of the public sector, and general, societal roil, which actually, traces back to the beginnings of the gains in inequality that become visible during the late 70s, really, but then, accelerate tremendously during the 80s. So the AFT was actually the avatar of the charter school, believe it or not. And Shanker's idea was a hybrid sort of model, so that, yes, entrepreneurial spirit would be unleashed, but the schools would remain, under the auspices of the public, and they would largely remain, of course, as a union leader, he wasn't interested in taking his union out of its major form of business, so his conception was, you would have this entrepreneurial spirit, you'd have teachers running schools, and, it would exist within the providence of a union shop. So now I think it's, in light of today's discussion, I think it's very interesting that the American Federation teacher is avowedly against charter schools, and Sandy Feldman, in her years succeeding her mentor, Albert, spent, kind of came off of charter schools gradually because she saw that the impetus had been co-opted by the rising right wing in the 80s and 90s. So in Ohio, there are a number of phases of this. And, and I think that it's really important for understanding what Kasich is about, because I think that, Kasich is a product of Cleveland area Catholic schools. And Ohio is the #1 state in the country for transferring public monies to parochial schools, and has been for over 20 years. So the way this works is that there's a politics of it, and the politics of it is that the conservatives from downstate agreed with the Catholic Democrats from upstate to arrange this bargain, and the idea was that all ancillary services would be funded by the public, so that if a child goes to so the pass-through from public school funding to parochial schools has been going on for quite a while, and it covers transportation, textbooks, and all ancillary services. So it's, 15 years ago it was $1,000 per student, as I'm sure it's somewhat more now. So when you think about public funding for schools and you get a per student figure, that buries that money that's passed through to parochial schools. So this was the subject, this was before the voucher system came into place, right? And because it was indirect services, it wasn't educating, it was allowed by the state Supreme Court.